Good morning, all. I just completed Daniel Dreisbach's book, chapter 4 in Daniel Dreisbach's book of reading the Bible with the Founding Fathers. It was a very enjoyable read and quite an interesting read. The title of the chapter was The Bible in the Political Discourse of the American Founding. In it, Dreisbach identifies 5 ways in which the Founding Fathers made use of the Bible in their writing and speeches. The Bible is used to 1. Enrich a common language and cultural vocabulary through biblical allusions, phrases, and proverbs. 2. It was used to enhance the power and weight of rhetoric. 3. It was used to identify and define normative standards for judging and ordering public life. 4. The Bible was employed to illuminate the role of providence in the affairs of men, as well as America's place in providential history. And finally, 5. It was used to gain insight into the character and designs of God and his dealings with mankind. The overall aim of the chapter was to show how important the Bible was in the founders' political expressions. The chapter then goes through each point and expands on it. And I'll just give a few examples because there's simply not time to go through each of the 5 points. So starting with point number 1, which is the Bible being used to enrich common language and speeches, Dreisbach describes how founders alluded to the Bible in their speeches because it was the most authoritative and familiar text of the time. Americans of the Revolutionary era were extremely biblically literate, something that we often forget in our own studies today. And the Bible provided for a common cultural vocabulary as well, amongst people of a very diverse cultural and denominational background. Even Thomas Paine, who hardly believed in Scripture, made use of biblical language in his speech, and he did it to great effect. Uh, let's jump to point number 3, which I thought was very interesting, which is the Bible being used to identify and define standards for judging and ordering public life. Dreisbach tells us that some in the founding generation looked to the Bible as a guide for Republican government. Some, especially Roger Sherman and even Thomas Paine, looked to the pre-monarchical state of Israel, interestingly enough, as a guide for how the new American nation should be governed. Now, this wasn't to say that classical and Enlightenment ideas also influenced the founders' thinking, but really to show how important biblical ideas were to their thinking as well. Um, let's go to point number 4, which was to illuminate the role of providence in the affairs of men. Now, here Dreisbach explains how many founders, and colonial Americans in general, believed in providential history. That is, that God has an active role in human affairs and guides the outcome of history. Um, this idea was central to Reform theology, especially, of which many Americans, in fact, probably most Americans at the time, adhered to in one way or another. Um, Dreisbach also points to Federalist 37 in the Federalist Papers that describes the finger of that almighty hand as it governs the affairs of men, as, as an example of his point. Now, as for my thoughts, the chapter was fascinating, and I really appreciated how Dreisbach organized his thinking into 5 digestible points, making it easy to comprehend and follow. And after naming these points, he went through each one and gave some great examples to argue his case. Now, while the number of historians who seriously look at the role of religion, especially the Bible, in the founding era is small, his claims are supported by other scholars of the era. James P. Byrd of Vanderbilt is a great example. Uh, in his book Sacred Scripture, Sacred War, he asserts that Scripture was everywhere in revolutionary America. And like Dreisbach, he also discusses Paine's use of the Bible for its persuasiveness and as a standard for society, even if he didn't believe it himself. In a great quote, um, Byrd says regarding Paine, to inspire patriots, common sense had to make biblical sense. I thought that was a great way of summing it up. Additionally, historian Mark David Hall states that the Holy Scriptures were the most important source of authority for America's founders. Hall also shows that the founders referenced the Bible in their political discourse more than any other source to include Enlightenment thinkers, which is something most people don't think of today. Now, despite these strengths, I do have one recommendation for improvement for Dreisbach's chapter here. At the beginning of the chapter, he laments the fact that very little scholarship has been done on how the Bible informed the founders' political thought. And this is true, and Dreisbach is doing a great work by contributing to this. However, there have been some others who have worked in this area, Byrd, who I mentioned earlier, being one in particular. And I know Dreisbach cites Byrd's book in other parts of reading the Bible with the Founding Fathers, um, but I think mentioning it in this chapter would have been helpful to the reader. However, overall, this was a very informative chapter, and I would recommend this to anyone who is interested in the thought and discourse of the American founders. I'd also recommend this to anyone who's interested in America's founding history. Like Dreisbach and others lamented, the influence of the Bible on the founding of our country is an overlooked piece of important American history. And I think this is something that really needs to be remedied. Thank you.